Alright, let's get familiar with trim and sub-trim as it applies to your radio system. Now, we've got familiar with the layout of the physical attributes of a common radio system. You'll see the small trim tabs located close to each of the gimbals. And then in this case, we have a few more up top that are tied to some of our additional channels or auxiliary channels. But our four major primary trim tabs are our aileron or channel 1, channel 2, elevator, and then we get into our channel 3 throttle and our channel 4 rudder, which is again common setup. Now if you're doing a helicopter setup, these channels are specific to your particular configuration, but these are our main primary trim tabs. Now these are used in flight, so we want to make sure we have full throw on those. And like in the case of the Aurora 9, we have 50 positive steps, 50 negative steps in our trim tabs. So if we came off the ground and we already had the thing trimmed over quite a bit, we would lose that much more adjustment in the air. Again, first time you fly, you don't know how balanced the model is or how its characteristics are going to be in the air. So you want to make sure you have full options to be able to make those trim adjustments on those control surfaces. So, all right, it's fired up now. Our 5.2 volt indicator tells us our pack has enough voltage, and 7.3 is our main pack voltage. Everything's set and ready to go, and we verified that our all our trims, which are trim indications, are right there in 4 quadrants. They're all set to 0. The nice thing too is with the Aurora, you can, as you make adjustments to your trims, it'll show up, so you can actually see those steps as you make adjustments, positive and negative, so you can see where you're at when you start off. So first thing we want to do is, of course, stepping back to our physical servos. When we install our servos, we're going to make sure that our control horns are in nice parallel or perpendicular positioning, depending on how we're orienting the actual servo as it's installed. We want that as square and true as possible, so make sure that our main trim is set to 0, and then we'll see when we plug it in to the receiver where that servo actually centers out. You know, it'll come up and fire up, and it may be crooked like that. Now, if you put your control horn on and it's crooked, you can pull them off, and you can rotate them around and find the next cog that brings it as close to center as possible. And a lot of times what you'll find is you're either slightly left or slightly right. That's all right. Find which one's closest and stick with it, because then what we're going to do is step into our sub-trim and bring that up to true center as close as possible. So with all your control horns fastened, the final control horns you're going to use, I like to do this on the bench before I put it in if possible. If not, I'll put it in the model and snap the control horns on, find my center, my 0 position before I hook up my linkage. But the first thing I do is make sure my trims are set to 0, my main trims, and then I go into the model menu. We're going to go into the settings here, and we're going to take a look at the now one neat thing about the Aurora 9 is you can adjust how many steps each one of these trim tab adjustments takes. So if we go to the system menu and then to trim step, we can take a look at channel 1, which is this T1, and we'll go ahead and pull up our standard servo gauge and our servo. We've gone ahead and slipped in a needle indicator in there and put on our test horn just to check our total throws and get an idea of what changes this makes or what impact this has as we make changes, and to also show our 0 point or center point. So channel 1 is this T1. We have that selected right now. We can make adjustments as to how many steps it takes. Now 12 steps is to the true radio resolution. So 12 steps is what I'd say would be an average trim. We can take that down further and further, but what happens, like we've got it down on, let's say 2 steps here, as I move this trim tab, I'm making significant adjustments, and it's taken forever. It's actually only stepping 3 steps at a time, so it really adds a lot of fine resolution to that trim. Which, if you, depending on the application you're doing, if you've got a situation where you've got an extremely fast model, you know, sailplanes would benefit by having very, very smooth, finite trim. Larger models with, you know, like a large control surface or a park flyer, a foam park flyer, the precision isn't there on the control surface itself. So having greater steps is totally acceptable. I like to leave it just pretty much in this default 12 steps for most of the powered models that I run with, and I've been really happy with that. So let's go ahead and back out. That's your trim step adjustment. You can actually adjust it. We'll leave it at the factory setup of 12. We'll back out here. We'll go to the model menu, and then we're going to take a look at sub-trim. And this is going to get us into where you're going to deal with the actual trimming on the model or in the model on the bench before you get out in the field. So now our aileron servo is represented by the one in our test gauge or our servo gauge. And right now, out of the box, I set the control horn up as close to center as possible, and I'm still about 1 degree, maybe 1.5 degree off to the right, about a full degree. So what I'm going to do then is adjust my sub-trim for the aileron channel. We'll start stepping it down negative until we get 0, and we're about there. Looks like about -5 or -6 puts our sub trim right where it needs to be. Now this didn't affect the overall travel of the servo. All it did was just set the dead 0 point. Quite honestly, the way this was so close to 0 out of the box that you probably wouldn't even notice it if you didn't have this needle gauge and the actual servo gauge, or the needle indicator and the servo gauge hooked onto the servo. So you'd probably just go with it directly out of the box, and you're happy then because your servo's nice and square. Again, critical on helicopter setup and also critical on standard airframe setups on airplanes. You want those control surfaces and the corresponding linkage in the servos as true to 0 as possible. That way you have equal throw in both positive and negative on that control surface. If we start off with the servo at a disadvantage of a heavy offset, say for example, our servo horn is crooked like that, and we hook up our linkage, if you think of it from a linear fashion of pushing a rod or pulling a rod, we're only going to have so much movement to the positive before we hit maximum extent on the servo, and we're going to have a whole lot to the negative. So we're not going to have a very equal or symmetrical control surface from a positive and a negative movement standpoint, so we're going to have problems. You want to make sure that servo is nice and centered with your sub trims before you start connecting your linkage, and then you'll have equal push and pull on that control surface. And that's trimming and sub-trimming. It's really simple, straightforward, a very critical step. And the nice thing is by putting this -6 sub-trim in there and having our servo set to 0, when I go back and take a look at our main screen, our primary trim for that channel is set to 0, so I've got full +50 and -50 adjustments in the field when I take my model off the ground.